Theology has not, as a matter of fact, had a very distinguished record in promoting the study of other than the Christian religion. And this is rather puzzling. Most study of comparative religions that goes on in theological schools has historically been missionary-oriented, to find out the weird ideas of the prospects so as to be able to undermine them. Because you see, if you know in the first place that you have the true religion, there really is no point in studying any other one, and you can very quickly find reasons for showing them to be inferior, because that was a foregone conclusion. They had to be. And therefore, all arguments about the respective merits of various religions, especially where Christianity is involved, and often where Judaism is involved, and sometimes Islam too, all of which are essentially imperialistic religions. In all such discussions, the judge and the advocate are usually the same person. Because if, for example, you get into discussions as to whether Buddha was a more profound and spiritual character than Jesus Christ, you arrive at your decision on the basis of a scale of values which is, of course, Christian. And in this sense, the judge and the advocate are the same. And I really do marvel at this Christian imperialism because it prevails even among theological liberals. And it reaches its final absurdity in religionless Christianity, the doctrine that there is no God and Jesus Christ is his only Son. Because you see, there's some anxiety here that even though we don't believe in God anymore, somehow we've still got to be Christians, and obviously because we have a very curious organization which must be understood. The inner meaning of the church as it works in fact. A society of the saved, you see, necessarily requires outside it a society of the not saved. Because if there is not that contrast, you don't know that you belong to the in-group. And in this way, all social groups with claims to some kind of special status must necessarily create aliens and foreigners. And St. Thomas Aquinas let the cat out of the bag one day when he said that the saints in heaven would occasionally peer over the battlements into hell and praise God for the just punishment visited upon evildoers. Now, as you know, I'm not being very fair and very kind to modern theology, but there is this strange persistence of insisting that our group is the best group. And I feel that there is in this something peculiarly irreligious, and furthermore, it exhibits a very strange lack of faith. Because I believe that there is a strong distinction between faith on the one hand and belief on the other. That belief is, as a matter of fact, quite contrary to faith. Because belief is really wishing. It's from the Anglo-Saxon root leaf, to wish. And belief, stated, say, in the creed, is a fervent hope that the universe will turn out to be thus and so. And in this sense, therefore, belief precludes the possibility of faith, because faith is openness to truth, to reality, whatever it may turn out to be. I want to know the truth. That is the attitude of faith. And therefore, to use ideas about the universe and about God as something to hang on to, in the spirit of Rock of Ages cleft for me. You know, hymnal imagery is full of rocks. A mighty fortress is our God. In vain the surge's angry shock, in vain the drifting sand, unharmed upon the eternal rock, the eternal city stands. And there's something very rigid about a rock. And we are finding our rock getting rather worn out in an age where it becomes more and more obvious that our world is a floating world. It's a world floating in space, where all positions are relative and any point may be regarded as the center, a world which doesn't float on anything, and therefore the religious attitude appropriate to our time is not one of clinging to rocks, but of learning to swim. And you know that if you get in the water and you've nothing to hold on to, and you try to behave as you would on dry land, you will drown. But if, on the other hand, you trust yourself to the water and let go, you will float. And this is exactly the situation of faith. This is surely all implied in the New Testament. When, for example, Jesus began to foretell his own death, his disciples were very disturbed because it is written in our law that the Messiah does not die. And he replied, unless a grain of corn fall into the ground and die, it remains isolated and brings forth no fruit. Or rather, but if it die, it brings forth much fruit. And on another occasion, he said to the disciples, it is expedient for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, cannot come to you. But we have reversed all this. Jesus, to me, was one of those rare and remarkable individuals who had a particular kind of spiritual experience, which in terms of Hebrew theology he found most difficult to express without blasphemy. I and the Father are one. In other words, I am God. And that is something, of course, if you are a Hindu, that is a rather natural statement to make. You see, in our culture, which has Hebrew theology in its background, anyone who says, I am God, is either blasphemous or insane. Because our image of God, and the image, don't forget, has far more emotional power than any amount of theology and abstraction. It is our Father which really influences us as a conception of God, not necessary being or Tillich's decontaminated name for God, the ground of being, or Professor Northrup's undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. These aren't very moving, even though subtle theologians prefer this kind of thing and will tell us that when we call God the Father, we don't have to believe literally that there is a cosmic male parent, and still less that he has a white beard and sits on a golden throne above the stars. No serious theologian ever believed in such a God. But nevertheless, the imagery affects us because the image of the monotheistic God of the West is political. The title King of Kings and Lord of Lords is the title of the emperors of ancient Persia. The image of God is based on the pharaohs, the great rulers of the Chaldeans, and the kings of Persia. And so this is the political governor and Lord of the universe, who keeps order and who rules it from, metaphorically speaking, above. So anyone who would say, I am God, is therefore implying that he's in charge of everything, that he knows all about it, and therefore everybody else ought to bow down and worship him. But in India, if you say, I am God, they say, congratulations, at last you found out. Because the image is quite different. See, our image of the world is that the world is a construct. And it's very natural for a child to say to its mother, how was I made? As if, you were somehow put together. But that goes back to the imagery of Genesis, where God creates Adam and makes a clay figurine. And then he breathes the breath of life into the nostrils of this figurine, and it comes to life. So there is the fundamental supposition, which even underlies the development of Western science, that everything has been made, and then someone knows how it was made. And you can find out, because behind the universe there is an architect. This could be called the ceramic model of the universe. Because there's a basic feeling that there are two things in existence. One is stuff, material, and the other is form. Now, material, like clay by itself, is stupid. It has no life in it, has no intelligence. And therefore, for matter to assume orderly forms, it requires that an external intelligence be introduced to shape it. And therefore, with that deeply embedded in our common sense. It's very difficult for people to realize that this image is not necessarily for description of the world at all. Indeed, the whole idea of stuff is completely absent from modern physics, which studies the physical universe purely in terms of pattern and structure. But the Hindu model of the world, and I'm speaking of Hindu mythology, the popular imagery, I'm talking about the popular imagery on both sides. I'm not at the moment getting into theological technicalities. The Hindu model of the universe is a drama. The world is not made, it is acted. And so behind every face, human, animal, plant, mineral, there is the face or non-face of the central self, the Atman, which is Brahman, the final reality, which is not defined because obviously that which is the center cannot be made an object of knowledge any more than you bite your own teeth or lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's what there is, it's the basis, and you are it, which is a colloquial translation of the Sanskrit adage tattvam asi, that art thou. The idea being, you see, that the nature of reality is a game of hide and seek, because that's really the only game there is. Now you see it, now you don't. All nature is vibrating. It's a wave-like motion of crest and trough, pulse and interval, pulse and interval. Only we don't always notice that because our senses respond slowly, say to light, and light appears to be a continuous energy without interval. So there's the idea that goes like this, that for endless cycles of time, the supreme reality, the self, plays hide and seek with itself. That for a period of a kalpa, which is 4,320,000 years, the self is awake to itself and knows that it's it. But for another kalpa, it gets lost. It says to itself, man, get lost, and pretends that it is a vast multiplicity. That's exactly what you would do if you had the privilege of dreaming any dream you wanted when you went to bed at night. This would enable you, of course, in one night to dream 75 years of clock time. And what you would do, first of all, you would have marvelous adventures. You would have every conceivable delight and satisfy every wish. And then as time went on, that would get a little boring, and you would get more daring. You would have adventures. You would rescue princesses from dragons. And then you would get even more daring, and you would dream that you weren't dreaming. And then you'd get into really serious messes, because wouldn't it be a surprise when you woke up? And eventually, you would be dreaming that you were sitting here in this auditorium listening to me. You would eventually get around to that for your sins. So, well, maybe that's what's happening anyhow, you see. And in Sanskrit, this dream is called maya, but it's a word that means more than dream or illusion. It means creative power, magic, skill, art, and measurement. Laying down the foundations is making a maya. So then, the world is a big act. It's play, not in the sense of something trivial, but in the sense of a stage play. Hamlet is a play. You play the organ in church. That's not trivial. And so the actor of this play, being the best of all possible actors, takes himself in totally, almost. Because everybody knows in the back of their mind that there's something funny about being a self. So you see, when you go to the theater, you know, of course, that the proscenium arch tells you that what's going on behind this arch is not for real. But somehow the actor almost persuades you that it is real. He wants to get you sitting on the edge of your chair. He wants you laughing, crying. He wants you in a state of anxiety, so that he almost persuades you But you see, if the actor is as good as the Supreme Self, the audience is taken in thoroughly, and they believe the play is real. What skill! How marvelous. But you see, in all acting, there is behind the stage a green room. Out on the stage, the Lord does not come on as the Lord. He comes on as you and I, heroes and villains. But off-scene, he assumes his true nature and doffs his mask, which in Latin is his persona. In classical drama, the persona was the megaphone mouth mask worn for the open-air theater. And by a curious degradation of words, the word person has come to mean the real individual. And when Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote How to Be a Real Person, the real title of his book should have been How to Be a Genuine Fake. Well, now this image, this model of the universe, is disturbing to Christians. What is particularly disturbing is the element in it of what's a very special theological cuss word called pantheism. The feeling that if every part is being played by the Supreme Lord, then all the real distinctions between good and evil are obliterated. Now that is the biggest nonsense ever uttered. Distinctions between good and evil do not have to be eternal distinctions to be real distinctions. It is really to say that a distinction which is not eternal is not real is a highly un-Christian thing to say, and certainly a very un-Jewish thing. Because one of the fundamental principles of the Hebrew attitude is that all finite things that have been created by God are good. And therefore, a thing doesn't have to be infinite to be good. All finite things come to an end. Furthermore, to invoke the authority of heaven in matters of moral regulation is like putting a 2 million current through your electric shaver. It ended in the final asininity of the notion that if you went against the will of God, since evil is eternal, you would fry in hell forever and ever and ever. And as the Chinese say, do not swat a fly on a friend's head with a hatchet. Like all kinds of judicial torture and harsh justice, such ideas bring law into disrespect. And such a fierce God and such an unbending attitude resulted in the fact of people disbelieving in God altogether and, shall we say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So this is among many reasons why people are saying God is dead. It's very inconvenient to have the kind of God who is this authoritarian boss of the world, prying down over your shoulder all the time, knowing your inmost thoughts and judging you. It's a very uncomfortable feeling, and everybody's happy to be rid of it. It has never significantly improved anybody's behavior. In the so-called ages of faith, people were just as immoral, if not more so, than they are today. Because you see, all this fixed notion of God is idolatry. If thou shalt not make to thyself any graven image of anything that is in the heaven above, etc., the most dangerous and pernicious images are not those made of wood or stone. Nobody takes those seriously. They're the images made of imagination and conception and thought. And that is why in the fundamental approach to the Godhead, both the Hindu and the Buddhist, and for that matter the Taoist, take what is called the negative approach, which used to be known long ago in the Middle Ages as apophatic theology. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, to proceed to the knowledge of God, it is necessary to go by the way of remotion, of saying what God is not, since God by his immensity exceeds every conception to which our intellect can attain. So then, when of the Godhead the Hindu says all that can truly be said is neti, neti, not this, not this. And when the Buddhist uses such a term for the final reality as shunyata, which means voidness or emptiness, then textbook after textbook on comparative religion that I've read by various theologians say, this is terrible negativism. This is nihilism. But he doesn't realize that it's nothing of the kind. If, for example, you have a window on which there's a fine painting of the sun, your act of faith in the real sun will be to scrape that off so that you can let the real sunlight in. And so in the same way, pictures of God on the window of the mind need scraping off, because otherwise they become idolatrous. They become substitutes for the reality. Now I'm hoping that this sort of understanding will issue from God is dead theology. I'm not quite sure whether it's going to. Because as a matter of fact, there are precedents within the Christian tradition for an intelligent God is dead theology, for what I would call atheism in the name of God, or agnosticism in the name of God. The word agnostic has a curious history. It's based on the Greek word agnosia, which we used to translate into English as unknowing. And there's a very interesting mystical treatise of the 14th century called The Cloud of Unknowing, showing how the highest form of prayer, contemplative prayer, was that in which all concept of God had been left behind, where, in other words, one completely let go of clinging to God. And this was the supreme act of faith. So that you don't any longer need an image, because this gets in the way of the reality. But the moment you insist on an image, then you have the church as a huge imperialistic vested interest organization. After all, if the church is the body of Christ, isn't it through the breaking of the body of Christ that life is given to the world? But the church doesn't want to be broken up. By Jove, no, it goes around canvassing for new members. See, the difference between a physician and a clergyman is this. The physician wants to get rid of his patients, and he gives them medicine, and he hopes they won't get hooked on the medicine. Whereas the clergyman is usually forced to make his patients become addicts so that they'll pay their dues. The doctor has faith in turnover. He knows that there will always be sick people, and the clergy also need faith in turnover. Get rid of your congregations. Say, now, you heard all I've got to tell you, go away. If you want to get together for making celestial whoopee, which is worship, all right. But don't, when I was a chaplain in the university, I used to tell the students that if they came to church out of a sense of duty, they weren't wanted. They would be skeletons at the feast. It would be much better if they went swimming or stayed in bed, because we were going to celebrate the Holy Communion, and I meant celebrate. But somehow or other, you see, we take religion in a kind of dead earnest. I remember when I was a boy at school how wicked it was to laugh in church. We don't realize, as G.K. Chesterton said, that the angels fly because they take themselves lightly. And as Dante said in the Paradiso, when he heard the song of the angels, it sounded like the laughter of the universe. Well, what are those angels doing? They're saying Alleluia, 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 which doesn't really mean anything. It's sublime nonsense. And so in the same way, there are Buddhist texts and Hindu texts, which are the chants of the Buddhas or the divine beings, which don't mean anything at all. They never did mean anything. They are just glorious lalling, glossolalia. So the point that I wish to make most strongly is that behind a vital religious life for the West, there has to be faith which is not expressed in things to which you cling, in ideas, opinions to which you cling in a kind of desperation. Faith is the act of letting go, and that must begin with letting go of God. Let God go. The point that I wish to make most strongly is that behind a vital religious life for the West, there has to be faith which is not expressed in things to which you cling, in ideas, opinions to which you cling in a kind of desperation. Faith is the act of letting go, and that must begin with letting go of God. Let God go. But you see, this is not atheism in the ordinary sense. Atheism in the ordinary sense is fervently hoping that there isn't a God. It has become extremely plausible that this trip between the maternity ward and the crematorium is what there is to life. And we still have, going into our common sense, the 19th century myth which succeeded the ceramic myth in Western history. I call it the myth of the fully automatic model of the universe. Namely, that it's stupid, it's blind force, Haeckel's gyration or fortuitous congress of atoms is of the same vintage as Freud's libido, the blind surge of lust at the basis of human psychology. But when you consider this attitude, you know, what is the poetic counterpart of it? Man is a little germ that lives on an unimportant rock ball that revolves about an insignificant star on the outer edges of one of the smaller galaxies. God, what a put down that was. But on the other hand, if you think about that for a few minutes, I am absolutely amazed to discover myself on this rock ball rotating around a spherical fire. It's a very odd situation. And the more I look at things, I cannot get rid of the feeling that existence is quite weird. I know that. See, a philosopher is a sort of intellectual yokel who gawks at things that sensible people take for granted. And sensible people, existence is nothing at all. I mean, it's just basic, and just go on and do something. See, this is the current movement in philosophy. Logical analysis says you mustn't think about existence. It's a meaningless concept. Therefore, philosophy has become the discussion of trivia. And philosophical journals is now as satisfactorily dull as any other kind of purely technical inquiry. No good philosopher lies awake nights worrying about the destiny of man and the nature of God and all that sort of thing, because a philosopher today is a practical fellow who comes to the university with a briefcase at 9 and leaves at 5. He does philosophy during the day, which is discussing whether certain sentences have meaning, and if so, what. And then he would, as William Earle said in a very funny essay, he would come to work in a white coat if he thought he could get away with it. The problem is, he's lost his sense of wonder. Wonder is like, in modern philosophy, something you mustn't have. It's like enthusiasm in 18th century England. It's very bad form. But you see, I don't know what question to ask when I wonder about the universe. It isn't a question that I'm wondering about, it's a feeling that I have. Imagine, if you had an interview with God, everybody was going to have an interview with God, and you were allowed to ask one question. What would you ask? And don't rush into it. You will soon find that you have no idea what to ask. Because I cannot formulate the question that is my wonder. The moment my mouth opens to utter it, I suddenly find I'm talking nonsense. But that should not prevent wonder from being the foundation of philosophy. Well, as Aristotle said, wonder is the beginning of philosophy. Because it strikes you that existence is very, very strange. And then more so when this so-called insignificant little creature has inside his skull a neurological contraption that is able to center itself in the midst of these incredible expanse of galaxies and start measuring the whole thing. That is quite extraordinary. And then furthermore, when you realize that in a world where there are no eyes, the sun would not be light, and that in a world where there were no soft skins, rocks would not be hard, nor in a world where there were no muscles would they be heavy. Existence is relationship, and you are smack in the middle of it. So there is obviously a place in life for a religious attitude in the sense of awe, astonishment at existence. And that is also a basis of respect for existence. We don't have very much of it in this culture, even though we call it materialistic. A materialist is a person who loves material. And I suppose in the Christian tradition and in the Jewish, one would say that the Lord God is the greatest materialist. Because, you know, as William Temple once said, God is interested in many other things than religion. Were God only interested in religion, the world would consist of nothing but church buildings and Bibles and clergymen. And that would be pretty boring. So, in the culture that we call materialistic today, we are, of course, bent on the total destruction of material and its conversion into junk and poisonous gas as quickly as possible. This is not a materialistic culture because it has no respect for material. And respect is in turn based on wonder, on feeling the marvel of just an ordinary pebble in your fingers. So I'm afraid, you see, for the God is dead theology, that it will sort of drift off into secular do-goodery in the name of Jesus. And this is, I think, where we can be strongly revivified and stimulated by the introduction into our spiritual life of certain things that are oriental. Now you see, it must be understood that the crux of the Hindu and Buddhist disciplines is an experience, not a theory, not a belief. If we say that a religion is a combination of creed, code, and cult, in other words, this is true of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And if they are religions, Buddhism is not. Because the creed is a revelation, a revealed symbolism of what the universe is about, and you are commanded to believe in it on the divine authority. The code is the revealed will of God for man, which you are commanded to obey, and the cult is the divinely revealed form of worship which you must practice. Commandment, because God is boss, he's ruler, King of kings and Lord of lords. But the disciplines, say, of yoga in Hinduism, or of the various forms of Buddhist meditation, do not require you to believe anything. And they have no commandments in them. They do indeed have precepts, but they are really vows which you undertake and on your own responsibility, not in obedience to anybody. They are experimental techniques for changing consciousness. And the thing they are mainly concerned with is helping human beings to get rid of the hallucination that each one of us is a skin-encapsulated ego. You know, a little source, a little man inside your head, located between the ears and behind the eyes, who is the source of conscious attention and voluntary behavior. Most people, you know, don't really think that they are anything but that, and that the body is a thing you have. Mummy, who would I have been if my father had been someone else? See, the parents give you the body and you pop the soul into it at some period, conception or parturition, nobody could ever decide. And this attitude stays with us, that we are something in a body, that we have a body, and we are not it. So we experience the beating of the heart as something that happens to me, whereas talking or walking is something that I do. Don't you beat your heart? Language won't allow you to think that. It's not customary to say so. How do you think? How do you manage to be conscious? You don't know. How do you open and close your hand? Do you know? If you're a physiologist, you may be able to say, but that doesn't help you to open and close your hand any better than I do. See, I know how to do it, but I can't put it into words. In the same way, the Hindu God knows how he creates this whole universe because he does it. But he wouldn't explain it. That would be stupid. You might as well try to drink the Pacific Ocean with a fork. So when a Hindu gets enlightened and he recovers from the hallucination of being a skin-encapsulated ego and finds out that central to his own self is the eternal self of the universe, and you go up to him and say, well, how do you do all this? He says, well, just like you open and close your hand. And because we're all it. Whenever a questioner used to come to Sri Ramana, the great Hindu sage who died a few years ago, they said to him, Master, was I living before in a previous incarnation? And if so, who was I? And he would say, who is asking the question? Who are you? And a spiritual teacher in both Hinduism and Buddhism is a kind of, well, what he does to awaken you, to get you over the hallucination of being the skin-encapsulated ego, he bugs you in a certain way. He has a funny look in his eye, as if to say, come off it, Shiva, I know what you're doing. You say, what, me? And he looks at you in a funny way. And finally, you get feeling that he sees all the way through you, and therefore that all your selfish and evil thoughts and nastinesses are transparent to this gaze. And then you have to try and alter them. He suggests, you see, that you practice the control of the mind, that you become desireless. You give up selfish desire so as to cease to be a skin-encapsulated self. And then you may have some success in quieting your mind and in concentrating. But then after that, he'll throw a curve at you, which is, but aren't you still desiring not to desire? Why are you trying to be unselfish? Well, the answer is, I want to be on the side of the big battalions. I think it's going to pay better to be unselfish than to be selfish. Well, Luther saw that. Augustine saw that. But there it is. Because what he's done, you see, he's beginning to make you see the unreality, the hallucinatory quality of a separate self. This has merely conventional reality in the same sense as lines of latitude and longitude, the measurements of the clock. That's why one of the meanings of Maya, illusion, is measurement. Things, for example, are measurements. They are units of thought, like inches are units of measurement. There are no things in physical nature. How many things is a thing? It's any number you want. Because a thing is a think, a unit of thought. It's as much of reality as you can catch hold of in one idea. So, when this realization of the hallucination of the separate self comes about, it comes about through discovering that your alleged separate self can't do anything. It can't improve itself, either by doing something about it or by doing nothing about it. Both ways are based on illusion. You see, this is what you have to do to get people out of hallucinations. You make them act consistently on the suppositions of the hallucination. People who believe that the earth is flat cannot possibly be talked into seeing that it's round because they know it's flat. Because can't you see? So what you do is this. You say, let's go and look over the edge. Wouldn't that be fun? But you see, to be sure that we do get to the edge, we must be very careful not to walk in circles. So you perform a discipline. You go steadily and rigorously westwards along latitude 40 or something. And then when you get back to the place where you started, he is convinced that the world is at least cylindrical. By experiment. By reductio ad absurdum of his premises. And so in the same way, the guru, whether Hindu or Buddhist, performs a reductio ad absurdum on the premise of the skin-encapsulated ego. Well, what happens then? You might imagine from garbled accounts of Eastern mysticism, that one thereupon disappears forever into an infinite sea of faintly mauve jello. And become so lost to the world and entranced that you forget your name, address, telephone number, and function in life. And nothing of the kind happens. The state of mystical illumination, although it may in its sudden onset be accompanied by a sensation of tremendous luminescence and transparency, as you get used to it, it's just like everyday life. Here are the things that you formerly thought were separate individuals, and here is you, who you formerly thought was merely confronting these other people. When the great Dr. D.T. Suzuki was asked, what is it like to be enlightened? He said, it's just like ordinary everyday experience, except about 2 inches off the ground. Because what is altered is not the way your senses perceive. What is altered is what you think about it. Your definitions of what you see, your evaluation of it. So when you don't cling to it, when you have no longer a hostile attitude to the world because you know the world is you, it is. I mean, let's take it from the point of view of biology. If I describe the behavior of a living organism, I cannot possibly describe that behavior without simultaneously describing the behavior of the environment. So that I discover that I don't describe organisms in environments, I describe a unified field of behavior called an organism environment. It's an awkward word, but there it is. The environment doesn't push the organism around. The organism doesn't push the environment around. They are two aspects or poles of the same process. And so you have to understand that this attitude towards nature, seeing the fundamental unity of the self which manifests it all, is not an attitude, as missionaries are apt to suppose, which denies the value of differentiation. You must understand the principle of what are called identical differences. Take a coin. The head side is a different side from the tail side, and yet the two are inseparable. Take the operation of buying and selling. Selling is a different operation from buying. But you can't buy unless somebody sells at the same time, and vice versa. This is what is meant by the underlying unity of opposites, what is called in Hinduism Advaita, or non-duality. Or when the Chinese use the word Tao to designate the way of operation of the positive and negative principles, the yang and the yin. It is not a unity that annihilates differences, but a unity which is manifested by the very differentiations that we perceive. Just as it's all polar. It's like the two poles of a magnet. Different, but yet one magnet. So when we say Oriental monism is a point of view towards life which merges everything into a kind of sickening goo. This is terribly unfair. It just isn't so. If you argue that the sort of doctrine that everybody is really the Godhead destroys the possibility of real love between individuals, because you have to be definitely other than I if I'm to love you, otherwise it's all self-love, well, that argument collapses in view of the doctrine of the Trinity. If the three persons are one God, then they can't love each other by the same argument. Hinduism simply uses the idea which is in the Christian Trinity, only it makes it a multi-Trinity instead of a three-one. That's all. Of course, the thorn in the flesh is always, in approaching a doctrine which seems to be monistic or pantheistic, what about evil? Are we to make the ground of being responsible for evil? And we don't want to do that because we want to keep God's skirts clean. In spite of the fact that our own Hebrew Bible says, I am the Lord, there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And haven't you heard the story about the Yetzer Hara? That according to Jewish theology, the Lord God implanted in Adam at the beginning of time a thing called the Yetzer Hara. It means the wayward spirit. I call it the element of irreducible rascality. And it's very necessary to have this in order to be human. You see, how it was done was this prohibition not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That was the one sure way of getting it eaten. But of course, when the Lord God accused Adam and said, you've been eating of that tree I told you not to eat. And he passed the buck to Eve and said, this woman that thou gavest me, she tempted me and I did eat. And he looked at Eve, now what about it? She said, well, it was the serpent. And he looked at the serpent. The serpent didn't say anything. Because he knew too much and he wasn't going to give away the show. Who is it that sits at the left hand of God? We know who sits at the right hand. It's hushed up, because that's the side where the district attorney sits. And in the book of Job, of course, you know Satan is the district attorney at the court of heaven. He's the prosecutor. He's a faithful servant of the court. Because, you see, the whole problem is, it would be very bad indeed if God were the author of evil and we were his victims. That is to say, if we keep the model of the king of the universe and the creatures are all subjects of the king, then a God who is responsible for evil is being very unkind to other people. But in this theory, God is not another person. There are no victims of God. He's never anything but his own victim. You are responsible. And if you want to stay in the state of illusion, stay in it. But you can always wake up. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream at night any dream you wanted to dream. And you would, of course, be able to alter your time sense and slip, say, 75 years of subjective time into 8 hours of sleep. You would, I suppose, start out by fulfilling all your wishes. You could design for yourself what would be the most ecstatic life. Love affairs, banquets, dancing girls, wonderful journeys, gardens, music beyond belief. And then after a couple of months of this sort of thing at 75 years a night, you would be getting a little taste for something different. And you would move over to an adventurous dimension where there were certain dangers involved and the thrill of dealing with dangers. And you could rescue princesses from dragons and go on dangerous journeys, make wonderful explosions and blow them up, and eventually get into contest with enemies. And after you've done that for some time, you'd think up a new wrinkle to forget that you were dreaming, so that you would think it was all for real, and to be anxious about it. And then, because it'd be so great when you woke up, and then you'd say, well, like children who dare each other on things, how far out could you get? What could you take? What dimension of being lost, of abandonment of your power, what dimension of that could you stand? You could ask yourself this because you know you'd eventually wake up. And after you'd gone on doing this, you see, for some time, you would suddenly find yourselves sitting around in this room with all your
personal involvements, problems, etc., talking with me. How do you know that's not what you're doing? Could be. Because after all, what would you do if you were God? If you were what there is, the self. In the Upanishads, the basic texts of Hinduism, one of them starts out saying, in the beginning was the self. And looking around, it said, I am. And thus it is that everyone to this day, when asked who is there, says it is I, and thereafter gives whatever particular name he may have. For if you were God, and in this sense that you knew everything, and you were completely transparent to yourself through and through, you would be bored. Because if, looking at it from another way, we push technology to its furthest possible development, and we had, instead of a dial telephone on one's desk, a more complex system of buttons, and one touch beep would give you anything you wanted. Aladdin's lamp. You would eventually have to introduce a button labeled surprise. Because all perfectly known futures, as I pointed out, are past. They have happened, virtually. It is only the true future is a surprise. So if you were God, you would say to yourself, man, get lost. And it's strange that this idea is obscurely embedded in the Christian tradition, when in the Epistle to the Philippians, St. Paul speaks of God the Son, the Logos, the Word of God, who is incarnate in Christ, and says, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, thought not equality with God a thing to be clung to, but made himself of no reputation, and humbled himself, and was found in fashion as a man, and became obedient to death. Same idea. Same idea as the idea of the dream. You get that very far out dream of getting as extreme as you can get. And so this then is the basis of the Hindu view of the universe and of man. The Hindu looks upon the universe as a drama. The Westerner, of course, looks upon the universe as a construct, as something made. And it is not therefore insignificant that Jesus was the son of a carpenter. The Chinese looks upon the universe as an organism, as we shall subsequently see. But the dramatic idea is basic to Hinduism. Now, you can speak about Hinduism on two levels, at least. One I will call the metaphysical level, and the other the mythological level. If you speak on the metaphysical level, you can speak only in negative language. You can say what the divine, the ultimate reality, is not. If you speak on the mythological level, you may speak of what the divine is like. Because myth is not a falsehood, as one uses the word in a sophisticated way. A myth is an image, a concrete image, in terms of which man makes sense of the world. And thus the idea of God the Father, or God the Maker, is a myth, because it's an image. And Christian theologians distinguish equally between two kinds of theological language, which are respectively called cataphatic and apophatic. Apophatic language is negative, as when we say God is infinite and eternal. Cataphatic language is mythological, as when we say God the Father, God is love, and all the positive designations. We are not saying God is a cosmic male parent, but is analogous with the Father. So with Hinduism. But what I'm going to speak to you in, first of all, is the mythological language of Hinduism. The idea of the universe as the big act. The universe is God playing hide and seek with himself. For God is thought of fundamentally to the Hindu as the self, the cosmic I. And it is a basic proposition for the Hindu that only the self, the Godhead, is real. There is nothing other than the Godhead. So that the appearance, the feeling that there are other things than the Godhead is called Maya. Maya. We ordinarily translate that word illusion. But you must be careful about the word illusion. Illusion is related to the Latin ludere. And that means play. And this is why the analogy of the world is dramatic. It's a play. In the sense of a stage play. Now, when you go to the theater, you know what you're going to see is not for real. Because the proscenium arch tells you that everything that happens on the far side of that arch is only in play, not serious. But the actor, and you will hope that he will be good at it, is going to try and persuade you that it's for real. So that he will so move you that you are crying or sitting in anxiety upon the edge of your chair. And so the audience is almost persuaded to be taken in. Now, what about if this would happen with the very best actor of all, the great actor? The audience would, of course, be completely taken in. But in this case, of course, the actor and the audience are the same, the self. The self has thus the capacity to abandon itself, to forget itself, to hide from itself, and thus to make the most completely convincing illusion, but in play. And so the activity, the creative activity of the Godhead in Hinduism is called lila, which means play. Our word lilt is related to it, I think. But so also in the book of Proverbs, you will find a discourse being given by the divine wisdom. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his ways before his works of old. I think it's the 22nd chapter of Proverbs, in the course of which the wisdom says that its delight was to rejoice, the King James Bible says, in the presence of God and with the sons of men. But the Hebrew translated rejoice says play. Rejoice is a sort of dignified Elizabethan, but it says play. And St. Thomas, aware of this, said that the divine wisdom was above all to be compared with games, because games are played for their own sake and not for any sort of ulterior motive. So also music is a kind of non-purposive thing, because you don't either play music to reach a destination, nor do you dance to reach a particular place on the floor. It is the doing of it itself that is important, because after all, if the object of music were to gain a certain destination, those orchestras that played fastest would be considered the best. So the idea is that dancing and music, more than other arts, represent the nature of this world. That it is playful, that it is sport. That it may be sincere, but is definitely not serious. And as G.K. Chesterton well put it once, the angels fly because they take themselves lightly. How much more so the Lord of the angels? So if a beautiful lady should say to me, "I love you," and I were to reply, "Are you serious or are you just playing with me?" that would be quite the wrong response, because I hope she's not serious and that she will play with me. I should say, "Are you sincere or are you just toying with me?" Because you see, the word play has many different senses. A person who is playing the organ in church is certainly not doing something trivial. When you go to see a play called Hamlet, you're not seeing something trivial. When the concert artist plays Mozart, he is certainly entertaining you, but it's not a trivial entertainment. But on the other hand, we would use play in quite a different sense when we mean just fooling around, doing it for kicks. So it is fundamental, as a matter of fact, to both the Hindu and the Christian traditions, that the universe is the play of God. But the Christian thinks of it in the terms of construction play, like building with blocks. And the Hindu thinks of it as dramatic play, of the actual participation of the Godhead in the creation, so that every being whatsoever is God in disguise. Hinduism speaks of the Godhead as, uses the word Brahman. This is a neuter form in Sanskrit from the root bri, which means to grow, to expand, to swell. The neuter form, Brahman, does not have quite the connotation then, you see, of kingship that we will find attached to the Western idea of God, but is also referred to as Atman. And this word we translate ordinarily the self. So you can have the para, param, you put the M in to connect the particle, Paramatman, which means para, the supreme self, or sometimes just the Atman alone, and that means the self in you. But the fundamental principle of Indian philosophy is Atman is Brahman. Your self is the supreme self. Or it is expressed also in the formula Tat Tvam Asi. Colloquially translated, you're it. Or Tat, that, Tvam, Latin tuam, you, Asi, are. You are that thou art. Tat, of course, is the first word uttered by a baby. Da, 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 da. And fathers flatter themselves that it's saying da-da. It's not. It's saying that. Da, 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 da. And so it's pointing to thatness in everything. It's very important to see this. Because everything is just that. I can say it in a negative way, which you won't appreciate at first, perhaps. Everything is meaningless. Only words have meaning, because they point to something other than themselves. The sound water is undrinkable, but it points to the drinkable reality. When you say, though, what is that, pointing at the water, and somebody says water, he's not being correct. because what you're pointing at is not the noise water. So it's not water. It's that. Duh. And water's a kind of jazz. And it's just doing that. And you can get to see, too, people are a kind of jazz. They talk and communicate with each other, but what does that mean? Well, they get together and they make more people, and they do this and they do that, and they eat and they go on doing this jazz, but it's just jazz. And you begin to see, as you do that, everything's like music, you see. It's all these complicated vibrations. In all kinds of ways. That's that. Or thatness. Ta-ta-ta, also called in Sanskrit. So anyway, this is the fundamental notion that you are really what there is, the works. Only you're playing hide and seek with yourself. And on a stupendous scale. Hindus measure time in units which in Sanskrit are called kalpa. And a kalpa is a period of 4,320,000 years. And there are two kinds of kalpa. One is called manvantara. And the other is called pralaya. Manvantara is the kalpa in which the universe is manifested, in other words, in which God puts on his big act. And pralaya is the kalpa, succeeding kalpa, in which the universe is unmanifested. And the Godhead does not dream, but is awake to its own nature. So that for these are called respectively the days and the nights of the Brahman. And this goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. The days and nights adding up into years and centuries and eons. They speak of crore. There's a Sanskrit measure, crore, C-R-O-R-E. A sort of a word that really I think means umpteen. Crores of kalpas. And this is the in-breathing and the out-breathing. There's the word hangsa. And this word in Sanskrit, hangsa, means a swan or a big water bird, like a gander. There's a myth that there is in the beginning the divine bird which lays the egg of the world. And the egg splits, and the upper is the heavens, and the lower is the earth. Now, so when the worlds are manifested, the Lord breathing out says, tongue. And when the worlds are withdrawn, the breath comes back. Hum. But if you say hung sa, hung sa, hung, sa, hung, it becomes sa, hung, sa, hung. Sa, ahang. That means, sa means that, the truth. Ahang, I am. I am that. It's like, imagine, when we get to the final moment in which the world is blown up. You know, imagine the countdown. This is the end. Somebody's pushed the button. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What are you listening to? Sound of the waves. And you can sit and listen to the little waves on the seashore. You'll get back here into this kind of thinking, and you're hearing the ocean of the universe going. And that's your breathing, too. It's all one rhythm. So it may be that every star was once a planet populated by intelligent people who found out about the fundamental energy of the universe and blew themselves up. And as they blew up, they scattered all kinds of stuff out, which became little planets. Which in a long time, life started all over again. Because the Hindu theory is very odd. Every kalpa in the Manvantara period, where there's a manifested world, is divided into 4 subdivisions of time, each one of which is called a yuga. That means roughly an epoch or an era. And there are 4 yugas, and they're named after the different throws in the Indian game of dice. There are 4 such throws, and the first is called Krita. That means, Kri means to do, as when we say something is done, truly done. It's the perfect throw of 4. The second is called Treta, which is the throw of 3. The next is called Dvapara, which is the throw of 2. And the final one is called Kali, which means the worst throw, which is the throw of 1. Now, each of these periods of the kalpa are of different lengths. Krita is the longest, and Kali is the shortest, and so ranged. So that when the world is first manifested, as in those dreams that I were mentioning to you, the world is in a golden age to begin with. It's perfect. And that is the longest period of time. Then when we get a little bit more adventurous, you see, the Treta means that in this era, a kind of disharmonious element enters into things. It's like a 3-legged chair isn't so secure as a 4-legged chair. It's just a bit inclined to tip. And as there was a fly in the ointment, the snake in the garden. Then comes Dvapara, in which the forces of good and evil are equally balanced. And finally, Kali, which is the shortest period, where the forces of evil are triumphant, and the world is destroyed at the end of it. For then the Godhead appears in the form of Shiva, who represents the destructive aspect of the divine energy, and whereas Brahma is the creative, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer. But Shiva is always the destroyer in the sense of the liberator, the guy who breaks up the ruts. And he comes on with a blue body and 10 arms and a necklace of skulls. Indian gods have many arms because they are cosmic centipedes. They do all things without having to think about it. Like the centipede doesn't have to think about how to manipulate its legs. Like you don't have to think how to grow your hair. And as Shiva dances what is called the Tandava, which is the dance of destruction at the end of the cycle, at the end of the kalpa, you will see that his hands contain clubs and knives and bells, but one hand is like that. And that gesture means don't be afraid. It's a big act. It is all, as it were, the outflowing of your own consciousness, of your own mind. Now then, Hindu life is related to this cosmology. And the objective of life is, of course, in the end, to wake up from the dream when you've had enough. And so the dreaming process is called sometimes samsara. Samsara is the round, the rat race. And samsara is divided into 6 divisions. I better draw a map, I think. This is common, you see, cosmology to both the Hindus and the Buddhists. This is the world of the Deva. And this is the same root from which we get both divine and devil. But Deva means angel. The highest and most successful beings in the universe. And so opposite, this is the world of Naraka, who are the most unsuccessful. These are the purgatorial worlds of extreme suffering. This is the world of Ashura. They are also angels, but they're angry angels, representing the wrath potential of energy. This is the world of animals. This is the world of Preta, for which we have no English equivalent. They are hungry or frustrated spirits who have enormous stomachs but mouths only the size of needles. Vast appetite and no means of fulfillment. And this is the Manu world, that is to say, the world of man. You don't have to take this literally. You could say, when you're extremely happy or ecstatic, you're here. When you are miserable, you're here. When you're dumb, you're here. When you're mad, you're here. When you're frustrated, you're here. But when you're more or less your normal, rational self, you're here. Now, so all life, through the period of the kalpas, goes grinding around this wheel. And if you go up, and you succeed, and you get to the top, you have to come down. They don't see success, in other words, in the world as a method of liberation, because it implies failure. So, the idea of liberation, which is called moksha, is the ideal of Hindu life. Wake up, it's a dream. And in time, there is no hope in time. Everything is going to get worse in time. Because, as you know, it does. We all fall apart in the end. Everything falls apart. Institutions, buildings, nations, it all crumbles. And people say, well, that's an awfully pessimistic philosophy. Well, is it? I would rather say that the people who have hope in the future are the miserable people. Because they're like donkeys, chasing carrots that are dangled before their noses from sticks attached to their collars. And they pursue in vain, always hoping that tomorrow will be the great thing, and therefore incapable of enjoying themselves today. People who live for the future never get there, because when their plans mature, they are not there to enjoy them. They're the sort of people who spend their lives saving for their old age and trying to teach their children to do the same thing, so that when they retire at 65, they have false teeth and wrinkles and prostate trouble and all that sort of thing. Where were you going? What did you think it was all about? Furthermore, the fact that life is transient is part of its liveliness. The poets, in speaking of the transience of the world, always utter their best poetry. Our revels now are ended. And these our actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great earth itself, aye, all which it inherits shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial and pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. And said so well, it doesn't seem so bad after all, does it? You see, there's always in the poetry of evanescence a kind of funny nostalgia. Moralists will say, those lovely lips which you so delight to kiss today will in a few years rot and disclose the grinning teeth of a skull. So what? The skull says, lying in the grass, chattering finch and waterfly are not merrier than I. Here among the flowers I lie, laughing everlastingly. No, I may not tell the best. Surely, friends, I could have guessed. Death was but the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. And monks used to keep skulls on their desks. And people nowadays think that was very morbid. But it's only, I went and visited a chapel in the Via Veneto in Rome, where there's a crypt where all the altar furnishings are made out of human bones. The altars are piles of skulls. There are rib bones arranged across the ceiling like floral patterns with vertebrae representing flowers. And they're all dead Capuchin monks. And there's a funny little monk collecting the admissions up at the top. And he has one of the funniest grins on his face I've seen in a long time. I said to him, you know, on the day of resurrection, there's going to be an awful lot of scuttling up this narrow staircase. People trying to reassemble their bones. Oh, dear Father, isn't that my fifth metatarsal? So, the whole idea, you see, is that everything's falling apart. So don't try and stop it. When you're falling off a precipice, it doesn't do you any good to hang on to a rock that's falling with you. See? But everything is doing that. And so, again, this is another case of our completely wasting our energy in trying to prevent the world from falling apart. Don't do it. And then you'll be able to do something interesting with the free energy. So that's moksha. Because when the Hindu says everything is unreal, the Westerner reacts and says, no, you can't treat life as a dream. It's serious, it's real, it's for real. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, how real do you want it to be? This is, in other words, everything, insofar as it's falling apart, everything is changing, it is like smoke. And we all feel that smoke has a lesser degree of reality than wood. It's an image of the evanescent, of the ghostly. So there's this idea the whole world is this mirage. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's only bad if you cling to it, if you try to lean on it. But if you don't lean on it, it's a grand illusion. So the word maya means not only illusion, but it means art, it means magic, and it means creative power. So this is the big act. And it's perhaps easier to feel the world in that way in a tropical country where death is very common and where you just watch things dissolve before your eyes and yet burst out and grow again. The whole world is changing. Maybe easier to think that way than in our environment. Although when you're out in California, the human landscape changes so fast that no town is the same for 2 years. Any mailing list that you have changes 1/3 addresses per annum. Nothing stays put. The hills are shadows and they flow from form to form and nothing stands. Now, this, you see, is not a pessimistic attitude, therefore, at all. To be able to realize that this world is simply a dream, a dancing play of smoke. Fascinating, yes, but don't lean on it. Life is a bridge, says one of the Hindu sayings. Pass over it, but build no house upon it. And so immediately you see that. This is responsible for the enormous gaiety of certain Hindu sages. This is a thing that often puzzles Westerners. The element of, they expected anybody who's an ascetic or a sage or something to be rather miserable, with a glum face. But on the contrary, you take this character who's going around these days, Maharshi Mahesh, he's always laughing. Because he sees through it. He looks on every side, and there is the face of the beloved, of the divinity, in everybody, in every direction, in everything, playing at being you. And you can look down into a person's eyes, way, way in, and you see the self, the eternal divine. And what is so funny, when it puts on an expression, saying, what, me? And the guru, the teacher. When people go to a guru, they get all sorts of funny ideas. They think, oh, he's looking right through me. He sees me through and through. He knows how awful I am. Reads my most secret thoughts. Because he has a funny look in his face. He isn't even interested in your secret thoughts. He's looking straight at the Godhead in you, with a funny expression on his face, which is saying, why are you trying to kid me? Come off it, Shiva, I know who you are. But, and therefore, you see, his role is to gently humor you into waking up as to your true nature. Now, of course, as I intimated earlier, the Hindu is therefore saying everybody is God. And this is why when a Hindu greets you, he does this. That is the act of puja, or worship to the Godhead in you. And our theologians get rather worried about that, because, you see, the two conceptions of God are different. Our conception is of the boss man, the king. Theirs is of the cosmic centipede, with the many arms, who does not have to think how to make the world, or rather to act the world. That would be an insufferable nuisance. You may think it rather wonderful when St. Thomas tries to explain that God is fully aware of everything that happens, and in every detail is willing each single vibration of any mosquito's wing. But when you really begin to think about it, that approaches intellectual elephantiasis. Imagine the Lord being aware of all the prayers and having to listen to the sort of prayers that go on every night. Woo! God heard the embattled nation shout, Gott strafe England, and God save the king. God this, God that, and God the other thing. Good God, said God, I've got my work cut out. But, so therefore, when somebody in India suddenly announces that he's God, nobody accuses him of blasphemy or of being insane. They say simply, congratulations, at last you found out. And they don't immediately request a miracle. As you see, if we get across someone who says, I'm God or I'm Jesus Christ, they say what they said to Jesus Christ in the first place. Command that this bread, these stones be made bread. And you know, he used to wangle out of it by saying, a wicked and deceitful generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given. The Hindu would say, But there is no point in changing it. It's going the way I want it to anyhow. Only really and truly, there is not this idea of God the technician, but rather the power of omnipotence is not to be able to do anything, but to be doing all things, whatever it is that's going on. And spontaneously, without having to think about it, which is very clumsy. Now then, I must say something about how then this relates to the life of the Hindu. Hindu divide life into certain stages, what are called the ashramas. The first is called brahmacharya, the second grihastha, and the third vanaprastha. Brahmacharya means the stage of the student, the apprenticeship. Grihastha, the stage of the householder. And vanaprastha, the stage of the forest dweller. This is related to cultural history of early India. Before we have agrarian communities, we have a hunting culture, which is on the move. In a hunting culture, every male knows the whole culture. There is no division of labor. And the holy man of the hunting culture is, of course, called a shaman. A shaman is a realized man, a man who knows the inner secret. He's seen through the game. And he finds it by going away alone into the forest and cutting himself off from the tribe. That is to say, from social conditioning. And he goes maybe for a long period into the forest and comes back. He's found out who he is. And he sure isn't who he was told he was. But as hunting cultures settle into agrarian patterns of life, what do? They build a village. And around the village they set up a stockade, which is known as the pale. And the village is always, of course, standing at crossroads. And there you get in an agrarian society a division of labor. And the division of labor comprises four. In medieval Europe, we call them lords spiritual, lords temporal, commons, and serfs. In India, they are Brahmins, Kshatriya, that means fighters, Vaishya, merchants, traders, Shudra, laborers. So you've got the priests, the warriors, the merchants, and the laborers. Division of labor. The four sections of town. So the four basic castes. So when you are born into a caste, and your duty as a grihastha or householder is to fulfill your caste function and to bring up a family. When you've done that, you go back to the forest, back to the hunting culture, and you drop your role, and you become nobody. A shaman again. So a Hindu calls one who does this a shramana, which is of course the same word as shaman. And the Chinese call him a xia man. Shaman. A shaman is an immortal. Why immortal? Because it's only the role that's mortal. the big front, the persona. The one who you really are, the common man, that is to say, the man who is common to us all, which you could call the Son of Man, that's the real self. That's the guy who's putting on the big act. And, of course, he has no name. Nobody can put the finger on him, because you can't touch the tip of the finger with the tip of the finger. So that means in practice, then, that when you hand over your vocation in life, which is called your svadharma, that means sva, that's the same as the Latin suus, one's own. Dharma means function. Your own function, or we would call your vocation. When you've completed it, you drop out and become nobody, because you're going to find out now who you really are. You're no longer Mr. Mukhopadhyaya, who is a cloth salesman. You drop that name, and you take on one of the names of God, Swami Brahmananda, Swami, bliss of Brahman. And you may go quite naked, like the Shivite holy men. No clothes. And they just go out and wander and don't make any provision for anything. They literally take no thought for the morrow, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, or wherewithal they shall be clothed. But you see, people respect them. They say, yeah, we got to have those people up there, because they are doing what human being is ultimately supposed to do, and we shall do it in our turn, and so give them some food. Now, naturally, caste, holy men, and all that kind of thing can be exploited. Anything can be exploited and abused. And we can look at it all and say, what a mess. Why don't you do something for yourselves? Why don't you kill the sacred cows and eat them? Why don't you clean up? Why do you permit all this disease? Just try and see something from another point of view for a change. I'm not saying that we should do what the Hindus do, but just look at it from another point of view. And they would smile at us and say, you really think it's as real as all that? Have you never experienced what's on the inside of this game? See, the trouble with you Westerners is you've never experienced bliss. You've never got down to the root of reality. You don't know that state of consciousness. And so you're frantically trying to patch everything up and pin it all together and screw the universe up so that it's fixed. You can never do it. All it is going wildly rushing around and creating trouble. Of course, Western-educated Hindus think the same way. They are now for rushing around and patching India up. And what's going to happen is they're going to arm all the millions of people in India. And they're going to create a lot of trouble in Asia one of these days when they become a powerful society.
They're already scared of the common man.
Yeah.
Scared of death, the Holy Ghost.
Oh, of course.
It's that idea in Christianity of struggling and not resting.
Yeah, that's true, you know, because of the big fight with the devil. You see? The war in heaven, you see. Now, the funny thing about that is, when you read Milton's Paradise Lost, long before Lucifer decided to rebel, the whole of heaven was armed. And he describes the legions of angels with their escutcheons and gonfalons and military deportment. Who was looking for trouble? You know, Lucifer was a good guy back then, see? The bearer of light. So the Hindu looks at our Christianity, though, and sort of thinks, my goodness. Here is the eternal self. But in the idea of Christianity, the Godhead is having a real far-out one. Because not only is he incarnating himself, say, as some wretched beggar, but he's incarnated himself as a Christian soul who believes that in this one short life he will decide his eternal destiny. And the possibilities of making a mistake are far greater than of being a lousy beggar. The possibility involved in the Christian gamble is to fry in hell forever, and ever and ever and ever. Even the Avicii hell at the bottom of the Naraka only goes on for about one kalpa. But the everlasting damnation, what an idea. So the Hindu says, bravo, God has really done a dare on himself this time to be a Christian soul. And the idea of a yana, or vehicle, comes from the basic notion or image of Buddhism as a raft for crossing a river. This shore is ordinary everyday consciousness, such as we have mainly the consciousness of being an ego or a sensitive mind locked up inside a mortal body. A consciousness of being you in particular and nobody else. The other shore is release, or nirvana, a word which means literally blow out. As one says, in heaving a sigh of relief. Nirvana is never, never, never to be interpreted as a state of extinction or a kind of consciousness in which you are absorbed into an infinitely formless, luminous ocean which could best be described as purple jello, but luminous, kind of spiritual horrors. It isn't meant to be that at all. Nirvana has many senses, but the primary meaning of it is that it's this everyday life, just as we have it now, but seen and understood and felt in a very, very different way. Buddhism is called in general a dharma, and this word is often mistranslated as the law. It's better translated as the doctrine, and still better translated as the method. And the Dharma is formulated originally by the Buddha, who was the son of a North Indian Raja living very close to Nepal, who was thriving shortly after 600 BC. The word Buddha is a title. The proper name of this individual was Gautama Siddhartha. And the word Buddha means the awakened one, from the Sanskrit root Buddh, B-U-D-H, which means to wake or to know. So we could say Buddha means the man who woke up. And the Buddha was a very, very skillful psychologist. He is, in a way, the first psychotherapist in history. A man of tremendous understanding of the wiles and deviousnesses of the human mind. Buddhism is made to be easily understood. Everything is numbered so that you can remember it. And the basis of Buddhism are what are called the Four Noble Truths. The first one is the truth about suffering. The second, the truth about the cause of suffering. The third, the truth about the ceasing of suffering. And the fourth, the truth about the way to the ceasing of suffering. So let's go back to the beginning. Suffering. The Sanskrit word is dukkha, D-U-H-K-H-A, dukkha. It means suffering in the widest possible sense, but chronic suffering, chronic frustration is probably as good a translation as any. Chronic frustration. And the Buddhism says the life of mankind and of animals, indeed also of angels, if you believe in angels, is characterized by chronic frustration. And so that constitutes a problem. If any one of you says, I have a problem, I don't suppose you would be here if you didn't in some way have a problem. Well, that's dukkha. Now, the next thing is the cause of it. The cause of it is called Trishna, T-R-I-S-H-N-A. Trishna is a Sanskrit word that is the root of our word thirst. Thirst, but more exactly craving or clutching or desiring. Because of craving or of clutching, in us we create suffering. But in turn, this second truth includes that behind Trishna there lies another thing called ignorance, avidya, A-V-I-D-Y-A. Non-vision. You see, vidya, vid in Sanskrit, is the root of the Latin video and of our vision. And in front of the word is non. As we say, atheist is a non-theist. So avidya is not seeing, ignorance, or better, ignorance. Because our mind, as it functions consciously, is a method of attending to different and particular areas of experience, one after another, one at a time. When you focus your consciousness on a particular area, you ignore everything else. That is why to know is at the same time to ignore. And because of that, there arises Trishna or craving. Why? Because if you ignore what you really know, you come to imagine that you are separate from the rest of the universe, and that you are alone. And therefore you begin to crave, to thirst for, you develop an anxiety to survive. Because you think that if you're separate, if you're not the whole works, you're going to die. Actually, you're not going to die at all. You're simply going to stop doing one thing and start doing something else. You know, when you die, in the ordinary way, you just stop doing this thing called Alan Watts. But you do something else. Later, man, like that. And it's nothing to worry about at all. Only if you are entirely locked up in the illusion that you're only this, then you begin to be frightened and anxious. And that creates thirst. So if you can get rid of ignorance, and widen your mind out so as to see the other side of the picture, then you can stop craving. That doesn't mean to say you won't enjoy your dinner anymore, and that it won't be nice to make love to girls or anything like that. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that enjoying your dinner and making love and generally enjoying the senses and all the experience, that only becomes an obstacle to you if you cling to that in order to save yourself. But if you don't need to save yourself, you can enjoy life just as much as ever. You don't have to be a Puritan. So then that state of letting go, instead of clinging to everything, supposing you're in business and you have to make money and keep a family supported or something like that, The thing is, do that, but don't let it get you down. Do it in what the Hindus call nishkama karma. Nishkama means passionless karma activity. And that means doing all the things that one would do in life, one's business, one's occupation, etc., etc. But doing it without taking it seriously. Do it as a game. And then everybody who depends on you will like it much better. Because if you take it seriously, they'll be feeling guilty. Because they'll say, oh dear, Papa absolutely knocks himself out to work for us, you see. And they all get miserable. And they go on, they live their lives out of a sense of duty, which is a dreadful thing to do. So, that's nirvana, you see, to live in a let-go way. Then the fourth noble truth describes the way, the method of realizing nirvana. And that's called the Noble Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is a series of 8 human activities, such as understanding or view, effort, vocation or occupation, speaking, conduct, etc. And they're all prefaced by the Sanskrit word samyak, which is very difficult to translate. Most people translate it right, in the sense of correct. But this is an incomplete translation. The word sam, the root sam, in Sanskrit is the same as our word sum, through the Latin summa. And sum, of course, the sum of things means completion. But it also has the sense of balanced, or middle-weighed, not W-E-I-G-H, but W-A-Y-E-D, middle-weighed, because Buddhism is called the middle way. And we'll find out a great deal about that later. But the thing that you must recognize is this. Buddhism, although when you say right speech, in other words, don't tell lies, well, let me put it this way. Every Buddhist who belongs to the Theravada school in the South expresses the fact that he is a Buddhist by reciting a certain formula. And it's called Tisarana and Panchasila. I'm talking Pali now, not Sanskrit. Tisarana means the 3 refuges, Panchasila, the 5 precepts. And they put your hands together like this and say, Buddhang saranang gacchami, Danghang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami. That means, I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in the method, the Dhamma, I take refuge in the Sangha, which means the fraternity of the followers of Buddha. And then he goes on and he takes the 5 precepts. Panatipata veramani sikkapadang samadhiyami. And this precepts one after another. I promise to abstain from taking life. Adina dana veramani. I promise to abstain from taking what is not given. Kamesu mityahara. I promise to abstain from exploiting my passions. Musavada veramani, I promise to abstain from false speech. Sura merya madhyapamadhatana, I promise to abstain from getting intoxicated by a list of various boozes. Now, this every Buddhist in the Southern School says. Mahayanists have a different formula. Well, this is the method, and the method, the Dharma, is therefore a moral law, just like the Ten Commandments. But it isn't. It's nothing, it's quite different. You see, you don't take the 5 precepts in obedience to a royal edict. You take them upon yourself, and there is a very special reason for doing so. How can you fulfill the precept not to take life? Every day you eat, even if you're a vegetarian, you must take life. And so on. Now, therefore, understand this, and this is absolutely fundamental to an understanding of Buddhism. Buddhism is a method, it is not a doctrine. Buddhism is a dialogue, and what it states at the beginning is not necessarily what it would state at the end. The method of Buddhism is, first of all, a relationship between a teacher and a student. The student creates the teacher by raising a problem and going to someone about it. You see? Now, if he chooses wisely, you see, he'll find this, if there's a Buddha around to use as the teacher. And then he says to the Buddha, my problem is that I suffer. And I want to escape from suffering. So the Buddha replies, suffering is caused by desire, by trishna, by craving. If you can stop desiring, then you will solve your problem. Go away and try to stop desiring. And he gives him some methods how to practice meditation and to make his mind calm and still to see if he can stop desiring. The student goes away and practices this. Then he comes back to the teacher and says, but I can't stop desiring not to desire. What am I to do about that? So the teacher says, try then to stop desiring not to desire. Now, you can see where this is going to land up. Or he might put it in this way. All right, if you can't completely stop desiring, do a middle way. That is to say, stop desiring as much as you can stop desiring. And don't desire to stop any more desire than you can stop. See where that's going to go? Because he keeps coming back. Because what the teacher has done in saying stop desiring, he has given his student what in Zen Buddhism is called a koan. This is a Japanese word that means a meditation problem. Or more strictly, it means the same thing as case means in law. Because koans are usually based on anecdotes and incidents of the old masters, cases, precedents. But koan, the function of a koan, is a challenge for meditation. Well, who is it that desires not to desire? Who is it that wants to escape from suffering? And here we get to a methodological difference between Hinduism and Buddhism on the question of who are you? The Hindu says, you yourself, he calls Atman, A-T-M-A-N, the self. And he says now, strive to know the self. Realize I am not my body because I can be aware of my body. I am not my thoughts because I can be aware of my thoughts. I am not my feelings for the same reason. I am not my mind, etc., because I can be aware of it. Therefore, I really am other than, above, transcending all these finite aspects of me. Now, the Buddhist has a critique of that. He says, why do you try to escape from yourself as a body? The reason is your body falls apart and you want to escape from it. Why do you want to disidentify yourself from your emotions? The reason is that your emotions are uncomfortable and you want to escape from them. You don't want to have to be afraid. You don't want to have to be in grief or anger. And love even is too much, you see. It involves you in suffering, because if you love someone, you have a hostage to fortune. So the Buddhist says the reason why you believe you are the Atman, the eternal self, which in turn is the Brahman, the self of the whole universe, is that you don't want to lose your damn ego. And if you can fix your ego and put it in the safe deposit box of the Lord, you think you've still got yourself. You haven't really let go. So the Buddha said there isn't any Atman. He taught the doctrine of an-Atman, non-self. Your ego is unreal, and as a matter of fact, there's nothing you can cling to. No refuge, really. Just let go, man. There's no salvation, no safety, nothing anywhere, you see. How clever that was. You see? Because what he was really saying is, any Atman that you could cling to or think about or believe in wouldn't be the real one. This is the accurate sense of the original documents of the Buddha's teaching. If you carefully go through it, that's what he's saying. He's not saying that there isn't the Atman or the Brahman. He says anyone you could conceive wouldn't be it. Anyone you believed in would be the wrong one. Because believing is clinging still. It isn't, there's no salvation through believing. There's only salvation through knowledge. And even then, the highest knowledge is non-knowledge. And here he agrees with the Hindus who say in the Upanishads, in the Kena Upanishad, if you think that you know Brahman, you do not know him. But if you know that you do not know the Brahman, you truly know. Why? Well, that's very simple. If you really are it, you don't need to believe in it. And you don't need to know it, just as your eyes don't need to look at themselves. You see? So that's the difference of method in Buddhism. Now understand method here. The method is a dialogue. And the so-called teachings of Buddhism are the first opening gambits in the dialogue. And when they say you cannot understand Buddhism out of books, the reason is that the books only give you the opening gambits. Then, having read the book, you have to go on with the method. Now, you can go on with the method without a formal teacher. That is to say, you can conduct the dialogue with yourself or with life. You have to explore and experiment on such things as, could one possibly not desire? Could one possibly concentrate the mind perfectly? Could one possibly do this, that, and the other? And you have to work with it, you see, so that you understand the later things that come after trying these experiments. These later things are the heart of Buddhism. So then, shortly after the Buddha's time, the practice of Buddhism continued as a tremendous ongoing dialogue among the various followers. And eventually they established great universities, such as there was at a place called Nalanda in northern India. This discourse was going on, and if you looked at it superficially, you might think it was nothing but an extremely intellectual bull session, where philosophers were outwitting each other. Actually, the process that was going on was this: that the teacher or guru in every case was examining students as to their beliefs and theories and destroying their beliefs, showing that any belief that you would propose, any idea about yourself or about the universe that you want to cling to and make something of, used for a crutch, a prop, a security, the teacher demolishes it. This is how the dialogue works, until you are left with not a thing to hang on to. Any religion you might propose, even atheism, they'll tear up. Agnosticism, they'll destroy. Any kind of belief, they're experts in demolition, so that they finally get you to the point where you've got nothing left to hang on to. Well, then you're free. Because you're it, you see. Once you're hanging on to things, you put it somewhere else, you see, something I can grab. And even when you think as an idea, then I'm it, you're still hanging on to that. They're going to knock that one down. So when you're left without anything at all, you've seen the point. Now that's the method of the dialogue, essentially. That is the Dharma. And all Buddhists make jokes about it. Buddha says in the Diamond Sutra, you see, when I attained complete, perfect, unsurpassed awakening, I didn't attain anything. Because it's like, to use a metaphor that is used in the scriptures, it's like using an empty fist to deceive a child. So you say to a child, what have I got here? The child gets interested immediately and wants to find out. You hide it, and the child climbs all over you, can't get at your fist. And finally, you do let him get it, and there's nothing in it. Many of the problems that are now being discussed by modern logicians are, unbeknownst to them, already in the ancient Indian books. Problems of semantics, problems of meaning, problems of the nature of time and of memory. All these were discussed with very, very meticulous scholarly sophistication. So that it is my opinion that this was a very, very fertile period of human history, and that the philosophy in which it eventually emerged, the philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism, is as yet the most mature and really intelligent theory of human life and of the cosmos that man has ever devised. It is characteristic of this point of view that it adheres to the middle way. And the middle way doesn't mean moderation. It means the bringing together of opposites, of what we might call in our world spirit and matter, mind and body, mysticism and sensuality, unity and multiplicity, conformity and individualism. All these things are marvelously wedded together in the worldview of Mahayana. And fundamental to Mahayana Buddhism is the idea of what is called the bodhisattva. Bodhisattva means a person who has as his essence, sattva, bodhi, awakening. And it's usually used to mean a potential Buddha. Someone who is, as it were, just about to become a Buddha. That was the original sense. And so part of the Pali canon is a book called the Jataka Mala, the tales of the Buddha's previous lives. How he behaved when he was an animal. How he behaved when he was a man long before he became Buddha. And in all these stories, he is represented as sacrificing himself for the benefit of other beings. But since he had not yet become a fully fledged Buddha, he's called in these stories a bodhisattva. That really means a potential Buddha. But the point is that as a potential Buddha, as a bodhisattva, he is always involved in situations where he's feeding himself for the hungry tigers and so on. Now, in the course of time, the term bodhisattva underwent a transformation. A bodhisattva matures and becomes a Buddha. And what does that mean popularly? It means that whoever is fully awakened to the way things are is delivered from any necessity to be involved in the world anymore. In other words, you can go onto a transcendent level of being where time is abolished, where all times are now, where there are no problems, where there is perpetual, eternal peace. Nirvana, in the sense of the word parinirvana, means beyond nirvana, super nirvana. So that if you are fed up with this thing, and you don't want to play the game of hide and seek anymore, you can go in the parinirvana state and be in total serenity. However, and again I'm talking the language of popular Buddhism, a person who stands on the threshold of that peace can turn back and say, I won't be a Buddha, I'll be a bodhisattva. I won't make the final attainment because I would like to go back into the world of manifestation they call samsara, go back into that world and work for their liberation. So then, when a Mahayana Buddhist does his formula for puja, he says, sentient beings are numberless. I take a vow to save them. Deluding passions are inexhaustible. Note this, inexhaustible. I take a vow to destroy them. The gates of the method, the Dharma, are manifold. I take a vow to enter them. The Buddha way is supreme. I take a vow to complete it. All this is impossible. You see, numberless sentient beings, because they are numberless, can never be delivered. Deluding passions which are inexhaustible can never be eradicated. So this then Mahayanist, they go, Shujo mu hen se gan do banno mu jin se gan dan homon muryo se gan gyaku butsudo mujo se gan jo. And that's their formula. The bodhisattva who returns into the world and becomes involved again is in fact regarded as a superior kind of being to the one who gets out of it. The person who gets out of the rat race and enters into eternal peace is called Pratyeka Buddha, which means private Buddha. Buddha who does not teach, who does not help others. And in Mahayana literature, that is almost a term of abuse. Pratyeka Buddha. Pratyeka Buddhas are classed with unbelievers and heretics and infidels and fools. But the great thing is the bodhisattva. All beings are thought of in popular Buddhism as constantly reincarnating again and again and again and again into the round of existence, helplessly, because they still desire. They are therefore drawn back into the cycle. The bodhisattva goes back into the cycle with his eyes wide open, voluntarily, and allows himself to be sucked in. And this is normally interpreted as an act of supreme compassion. And bodhisattvas can assume any guise. They can get furiously angry if necessary in order to discourage evil beings. Even could assume the role of a prostitute and live that way so as to deliver beings at that level of life. Could become an animal, become an insect, become a maggot, anything, all deliberately and in full consciousness to carry on the work of the deliverance of all beings. Now that's the way the popular mind understands it. And therefore the bodhisattvas are all revered and respected and worshipped and looked upon as gods, as we look upon God in the West, and as saviors as the Christian looks upon Jesus. But underneath this myth, there is a profound philosophical idea. And that is this. It goes back to the Hindu philosophy of Advaita and non-duality. Namely, the apparent dualism of I and thou, of the knower and the known, the subject and the object, is unreal. And so also the apparent duality between Maya, the world illusion, and reality is unreal. The apparent duality or difference between the enlightened and the ignorant person is unreal. So the apparent duality of bondage and deliverance or liberation is unreal. The wise, the perfectly wise man is the one who realizes vividly that the ideal place is the place where you are. This is an impossible thing to put in words. The nearest I could get to it would be to say that if you could see this moment, that you need nothing beyond this moment, now, sitting here, irrespective of anything I might be saying to you, of any ideas you might have rattling around in your brains, that here and now is the absolute which than which there is no whicher. Only we prevent ourselves from seeing this because we're always saying, well, there ought to be something more. Amn't I missing something somehow? See? And nobody sees it. Now, then also, the most far-out form of Mahayana Buddhism is called the Pure Land School. Jodo Shinshu. Jodo means pure land, Shinshu, true sect. And this is based on the idea that there was in immeasurably past ages a great bodhisattva called Amitabha. And he made a vow that he would never, never become a Buddha unless any being who repeated his name would automatically, at death, be born into the pure land over which he presides. That is a kind of paradise. He did become a Buddha, and so the vow works. All you have to do is to repeat the name of Amitabha, and this will assure the fact that without any further effort on your part, you will be reborn in his paradise when you die, and in that paradise becoming a Buddha is a cinch. There are no problems there. The Western paradise, you see, is some kind of a level of consciousness. But it's represented as fact as a glorious place. You can see the pictures of it in Koyasan, wonderful pictures, where the Buddha Amitabha, who is actually a Persian figure, he's related to Ahura Mazda, and he means boundless light. And the Daibuts at Kamakura, that enormous bronze Buddha in the open air, is Amitabha. So there he sits, surrounded with his court. And this court is full of apsaras. And apsaras are beautiful girls, playing lutes. And as you are born into the paradise, what happens when you die is you discover yourself inside a lotus. And the lotus goes pop, and there you find yourself sitting, coming out of the water. And here on the clouds in front of you are the apsaras sitting, strumming their lutes with the most sensuous, beautiful faces. See? And to get this, all you have to do is say the name of Amitabha. The formula is Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. And you can get this fast. Said many times, you see. So you're quite sure it's going to happen. But actually you only have to say it once. And you mustn't make any effort to gain this reward, because that would be spiritual pride. Your karma, you see, your bad deeds, your awful past, is so bad that anything good you try to do is done with a selfish motive and therefore doesn't affect your deliverance. Therefore, the only way to get deliverance is to put faith in the power of this Amitabha Buddha and to accept it as a free gift and to take it by doing the most absurd thing, saying Namo Amida Butsu, you see? Don't even worry whether you have to have faith in this, because trying to have faith is also spiritual pride. It doesn't matter whether you have faith or whether you don't. The thing works anyway, so just say Namo Amida Butsu. See? Now that's the most popular form of Buddhism in Asia. The two most vast temples in Kyoto, the Inishi and Higashi Honganji temples, represent this sect. And everybody loves Amitabha. Amida, they call him in Japan. Boundless light, infinite Buddha of compassion. Sitting there with this angelic expression on his face. It's all right, boys, to say my name. It's all you have to do. So when we add together prayer wheels, Namo Amida Butsu, they call it Nembutsu, that's the means of remembering Buddha. Bookcases, and all these things where you just have to and the work is done for you. Then wouldn't we Westerners say, especially if we are Protestants, oh, what a scoundrelly thing that is. What an awful degradation of religion. What an avoidance of the moral challenge and the effort and everything that is required. Is this what the Bodhisattva doctrine of infinite compassion deteriorates into? Now you see there is a profound aspect to all that. Just as there is the diamond and the ice, as we were talking about this morning, just as there is desperation and despair, nirvana, desperation and despair of the horrors, so there are two ways of looking at this nothing to do, no effort to make idea, depending completely on the Savior. For who is Amitabha? Popularly, Amitabha is somebody else. He is some great, compassionate being who looks after you. Esoterically, Amitabha is your own nature. Amitabha is your real self, the inmost, boundless light that is the root and ground of your own consciousness. You don't need to do anything to be that. You are that. And saying Nembutsus is simply a symbolical way of pointing out that you don't have to become this, you are it. And Nembutsu, therefore, on its deeper side, builds up a special kind of sage, which they call Myokonin. Myokonin in Japanese means a marvelous fine man. But the Myokonin is a special type of personality who corresponds in the West to the Holy Fool in Russian spirituality, or to something like the Franciscan in Catholic spirituality. Myokonins, well, I'll tell you some Myokonin stories. That's the best way to indicate their character. One day a Myokonin was traveling and he stopped in a Buddhist temple overnight, and he went up to the sanctuary where they have all these big cushions, like here, you know, for the priest to sit on, and he arranged the cushions in a pile on the floor and went to sleep on them. In the morning, the priest came in and saw this tramp sleeping. He said, "What are you doing here, desecrating the sanctuary by sleeping on the cushions and so on, right in front of the altar?" And the Myokonin looked at him in astonishment and said, "Why, you must be a stranger here. You can't belong to the family." In Japanese, when you want to say that a thing is just the way it is, you call it sonomama. So there's a haiku poem which says, "Weeds in the rice field, cut them down, sonomama, fertilizer." Cut the weeds, leave them exactly where they are, and they become fertilizer. Sonomama. And sonomama means reality, just the way it is, just like that. Now there's an expression, a parallel expression, konomama. Konomama means I just as I am. Just little me, you know, like that, with no frills, no pretense, except that I naturally have some pretense. That's part of konomama. And the Myokonin is the man, you see, who realizes that he, konomama, just as I am Buddha, am delivered by Amitabha, because Amitabha is my real nature. If you really know that, you see, that makes you a Myokonin. But be aware of the fact that you could entirely miss the point and become a monkey instead by saying, I'm all right just as I am, and therefore I'm going to rub it in. And I'm going to be going around parading my unregenerate nature, because this is Buddha too, you see? The fellow who does that doesn't really know that it's okay. He's doing too much. He's coming on too strong. The other people who are always beating themselves, they're doing the opposite error, you see. The middle way, right down the center, is where you don't have to do a thing to justify yourself. And you don't have to justify not justifying yourself, which is the mistake that most beatniks make. They justify not justifying themselves and go too far. So you see there's something quite fascinating and tricky in this doctrine of the great Bodhisattva Amitabha, who saves you just as you are, who delivers you from bondage just as you are, and you only have to say Namo Amida Butsu. Fascinating. But that is the principle of Mahayana. And that is, you see, your acceptance of yourself as you are is the same thing as coming to live now as you are. You see, now is as you are, in the moment. But you can't come to now, and you can't accept yourself on purpose. Because the moment you do that, you're doing something unnecessary. You're doing a little bit more. That's what they call in Zen legs on a snake, or a beard on a eunuch. You've overdone it, you see. How can you neither do something about it, nor do nothing about it, as if that was something you had to do? You see? This is the same problem as originally posed in Buddhism. How do you cease from desiring? Because when I try to cease from desiring, I am desiring not to desire. You see this? All of this is what is called upaya, or skillful device, to slow you down so that you can really be here. By seeing that there is nowhere else you can be, you don't have to come to now. Where else can you be? It isn't a task. It isn't a contest. What the Greeks called agon, agony, a contest. There's nowhere else to be. So they say, nirvana is no other than samsara. This shore is really the same as the other shore. It's not so if you look for this, Lankavatara Sutra says, if you look to try and get nirvana in order to escape suffering and being reborn, that's not nirvana at all.